All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. Welcome to Human Rights Community Organizing and Activism. My name is Frankie. I'm the Field Education Academic Coordinator at ACAP, and I'm here with Danielle Palos, who's a student representative at ACAP, who will be supporting the session today in the background. Thank you, Danielle. So firstly, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. So I encourage you to acknowledge the land that you are on in the chats. I am on Darug land. Thank you for those who have put the land that they are on in their screen name. That's very, very welcome. Thank you. So a little bit of housekeeping. This session is counting towards placement hours, so we will be taking random attendances throughout the session. If you want the attendance to be recorded, please make sure to update your screen name or display name to include your full name and student number, ideally. Sorry, institution that you're from, ideally. And again, this session is recorded, and the recording and the materials will be distributed through email after the session. So our presenters today are from Voices of Influence, a youth-led activism and advocacy organization. So thank you everyone from Voices of Influence for joining us today. I am really looking forward to hearing about your journey and what you would like to share with us about human rights, community activism, and organizing. I'm just going to quickly hand over to Alice Langton, who's the Director and Steering Committee Chair of Voices of Influence, to introduce herself and the rest of the team. Thank you, Alice.
Certainly. Thank you, Frankie. And thank you everyone who decided to join our event this evening. We're really excited to speak to all of you about human rights, which is a particularly important conversation to always have. So yeah, as Frankie said, we are Voices of Influence Australia, and we are a youth-led organisation that moves to inform and encourage the masses who are passive individual consciences into being active and collective voices for human rights. And we do that from a youth-led perspective. So all of us that are on the steering committee and our executive team are under the age of 30. And that's really to kind of live and breathe our vision of youth participation within the democratic processes involved with human rights and community organising, community activism, which is such an important role in the promotion, protection and attainment of human rights, not only in Australia, but globally. To tell you a little bit about myself, so I am the founding director of Voices of Influence Australia. I have a background in social work and I'm currently studying international law. I could probably bore you for ages about the connections between, the law and social work and how the two are crucial to the functionality of both careers. But I will just focus on kind of what led to the development of Voices of Influence. So throughout my studies and throughout my career so far has always been focused around the protection of human rights, whether from a mental health perspective, from a community perspective, from an international development perspective, and international human rights. So largely my work so far has been focused on international development with Child Fund, where my role was largely focused on locally led development, but also working as a correspondent between Child Fund and the United Nations, and particularly like the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And so part of the frustration that came from working in that space whilst I was studying is the lack of opportunities for young people to really participate in this space. And as my grandma would say, if you can't find someone to do it, you do it yourself. So that's why Voices of Influence was established. We're a very young organisation, not just in our demographic. Like I said, all of us who are on the steering committee and our executive team are all under the age of 30, but we're also only really been established since early March this year. But already in the short time that we've been established, we've seen significant traction towards our vision and mission as an organisation through, the work of a very committed and dedicated team that we have, and the kind of relationships and partnerships that we're building within the community sector as well. So I'll pass on to the rest of the team to all of us do a bit of introductions. All of us have come from very different walks of life and have a wealth of knowledge to be able to share with all of you today. So hopefully what we are able to share with you resonates resonates deeply. And you will have the opportunity later in the session to kind of join a breakout room if there's one of us that you would love to learn more from. But yeah, I was someone else on who was on my team. Would someone want to jump in and start off with their introduction?
I'm happy to jump in there. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate you being here. My name is Athena, so I'm the Health and Social Services Chair at Voices in Influence. Outside of this, I wear quite a few hats and do a few things, but my primary interest is in healthcare or the space of healthcare. I've worked for over 5 years in primary healthcare, and primary healthcare is just a fancy way of saying healthcare that's not in hospitals. So that's community health, medical centres, pharmacies, that sort of thing. I currently manage a medical centre, so I lead a team of 18 combined doctors, nurses and admin staff. I recently graduated my social work degree and my honours thesis focused on the topic of bringing social work into the healthcare sphere. I saw that there was a gap there and I thought it was really needed and really timely. I did a bit of research in that area and I part-time do some work at a domestic violence centre called Cumberland Women's Health Centre, and I also work here at Voices of Influence. So that's just a little bit about what I do, yeah.
I'm happy to jump in next. Hi everyone, my name's Taylor. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be speaking to all of you about some really important topics today. So as a background to me, I'm a recent law graduate. So I graduated last year with a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Politics, Philosophy and Economics. Throughout sort of my adult life and even into high school, I've been sort of involved in a broad range of community work. I have like a pretty decent set of mentoring experience. I've been a mentor for AIM, for YWCA, which is a feminist organisation, and a tutor for SCARF, which is the Strategic Assistance for Refugee Families. And recently, as of this year, I have joined New South Wales Young Lawyers as a submissions coordinator and a general delegate. I also volunteer for Share the Dignity, which is an amazing period poverty not-for-profit doing incredible work in that space. And I'm also here as the Legal and Political Affairs Director of Voices of Influence, which is an absolute privilege and a pleasure. And I'm super excited to see all the change and all the social impact that's going to occur in this team. And yeah, so that's basically a bit of background. In terms of a paid job, I am a law graduate at a commercial law firm in Sydney, and hopefully will be admitted as a solicitor early next year. So yeah, that's me.
I'm happy to jump in next. So obviously I'm Kathleen. I'm super passionate about child protection, the rights of the child, specifically in out-of-home care. I've worked in homelessness, women and children fleeing domestic violence, but I've always come back to my roots of working with children and child protection. Currently managing a house for children who don't have a foster placement and aren't able to return to home. And so these children can be anywhere from 9 years old up to 14. And then we have other houses up to 18 as well. I have joined Voices of Influence as the Child Rights Chair and super happy to be here today.
I'm happy to go next.
Oh, you go, Meg.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Meg. I'm the Development and Outreach Director for Voice of Influence. So I graduated last year with a Bachelor of Social Research and Policy. My role at Voice of Influence is kind of just about creating partnerships and establishing like our main projects and programs that we're currently working on and going to be working on in the future. I've worked in a lot of different areas, but my like central area of interest is climate change and environmental activism, particularly youth involvement in the climate movement. And so that's sort of where my activism and community organizing experience comes from, because I also currently volunteer with a grassroots activist environmental organization. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Jacinta. I am Voices of Influence's Communities and Justice Chair. I currently live, play, learn and grow on Gadigal country, but I grew up on Dharawal country, which is just south of the CBD in Warang, Sydney. I have a very strong passion for First Nations justice here in Australia and abroad. I myself am a non-Indigenous woman, but I am committed to the needs for sustainability and community activism and support for First Nations justice here and abroad. I, in Australia, am working full-time at Tramby, which is Australia's first and longest running Aboriginal controlled education organisation. I'm very passionate about education equity, doing things differently, utilising Indigenous knowledges in pedagogy and training to create more collaborative working systems and leadership. I also work and run a small community-led organisation in Achua country, which is in the Ecuadorian Amazon. It's an amazing opportunity to work with local Indigenous communities to create education models that meet their needs to build and maintain cultural strength and also advocate for their social rights and self-determinate justice. So excited to join this conversation and really looking forward to, yarning with you all.
I'm happy to go next. Hi, my name is Marie. I am the Chair for Peace, Conflict and Security at Voices of Influence. Like Alice, I did a bachelor's in social work and I'm now doing my master's in peace and conflict studies. I'm currently researching terrorism and counterterrorism strategies and how they have an impact on communities. I finished very recently working at ACAP. I was working at ACAP for the last 4 years, I think. I'm going to say 4 years. And I also just finished a role in behaviour therapy and I'm now moving to learning strategy. I've had a lot of focus in feminist organisations. Like Taylor, I did a lot of work in Share the Dignity in their media department, and I was the national media for Sydney Feminist, but now I'm shifting focus and I'm moving more towards a international focus. So that's about me.
Hi, I'm lucky last. My name's Kelly. I'm the chairperson for Gender Equality with Voices of Influence. So my background is more of like a media background. So at the moment I'm working in community news with a newspaper over here in Perth called the Perth Voice and the Fremantle Herald. I haven't actually graduated yet. I'm still in my last semester of a social justice and journalism degree. So yeah, my sort of passion has always been around gender-based issues. So I've really kind of worked at like the intersection of activism and journalism and kind of like using the voices of people in the community to elevate like their messages through like working with advocates and things like that, and then getting that published through the newspapers. Before that, I was working with Plan International based in London on their community events and fundraising team. So that was also kind of like communications focused. And yeah, Plan International is a charity that kind of focuses on the rights of girls specifically. I'm really passionate about a bunch of different gender-based issues. At the moment, I've been working a lot in the space of rights for sex workers and things like that, which is a very female-dominated industry, and sort of advocating for law reform in that space. But yeah, I've worked a lot in homelessness and things like that as well, and particularly where that kind of intersects with the experiences of First Nations women. So that's me. I'm really excited to get on with this and have some really cool conversations with you guys in the breakout groups.
Awesome. Okay, so that's our team. I am beyond excited and absolutely like privileged to have such a fantastic team of people to work together. We all have come from, like I said, such different walks of life and different experience, but we all have a similar purpose, which is the promotion and pursuit of human rights. And yeah, as Kelly just mentioned, in the second half of this webinar panel, we are going to be doing a couple of breakout rooms. So if any of the team members have captured your interest or you'd love to learn more about them, like absolutely take the time to jump into their breakout rooms when we get to that later on. So obviously the purpose of this panel is to talk about community activism and community organising, particularly in the human rights space. I'd also just like to preface this before I continue, is that I have a tendency to speak very fast, especially when I get excited. So, which is bound to happen in this panel. So if I am speaking too fast, please interrupt me or say something in the chat, and I will be much more mindful of it. But I'm about to share my screen to show you guys a bit of a model here. So this is a very basic model about community organising and community activism. It kind of daunted me that those of you joining us today might have a natural curiosity towards community organising and activism, but maybe needed a bit more guidance about putting that in context, particularly in the human rights space. So I will share this diagram model after this panel is finished for you to be able to have a bit more of a read through, and I would encourage you all to also reflect upon like which kind of activists you most resonate with and recognize yourself with. But to begin with, I'll start with talking about the 4 different types of activism. And so there's the citizen, the reformer, the rebel, and the change agent. All have equal importance and influence over the community activism space. But I find this a very helpful model to understand the different roles within those capacities. So the first main one I'll talk about is the citizen. So the citizen promotes positive, widely held values such as democracy and freedom, justice, nonviolence, and it's very much grounded and rooted in the center of society. So very much like focused around the value of community participation, and it protects against charges of extremism. So all very important characteristics and traits to have in the community activism space. For those of us who do identify as a citizen, there's some things to be mindful of that are potentially not so helpful or ineffective as traits, is sometimes all of us can be slightly naive or not necessarily realize in the full capacity how power holders and institutions serve elite interests. I think for those of us who are coming from a social work perspective, talking about anti-oppressive practice or being able to dismantle those barriers in place to understand the complexities of issues. And then the second, maybe slightly unhelpful characteristic that some citizens might have is being super patriotic, and maybe that's just having blind obedience to power holders or Australia or whatever country you might have an alliance to. And we see this typically, this kind of super that super patriot typically in older generations who are very respectful of the rule of law, but are maybe a little bit more resistant towards what people I think typically would say radical left-wing ideas, which is really just ideas of human dignity and respect and human rights. The second one I want to talk about is as a social reformer. And the social reformer uses official channels to make change. They use a variety of means such as lobbying, legal action, elections, and they monitor success to assure enforcement and expand success and guard against backlash. So I guess the reformers definitely takes a bit more of a formal, structured approach to community and social change, which again is absolutely has a space in the community activism space. But potentially some unhelpful or ineffective traits of those of us who identify as a reformer is that we have to be mindful of not promoting or trying not to promote minor reforms, and really recognizing that the personal is political, and always recognizing those oppressions in place first. And then the second thing to be mindful of is a co-optation, which identifies more with official power holders than grassroots. And obviously in the community space, we want to have the priority focused on the community and center that around our work always. There also something to be mindful about the reformer is that it's those roles are very limited by hierarchical and patriarchal structures. And often the case that we've seen, in reformer actions is that they do not advocate for paradigm shifts. They're very reactive to immediate needs, but it's hard sometimes within this position to really see the long-term goals and changes that need to be made, and the sustainability of those changes as well. The third one I'll talk about is the rebel. The rebel, I think, is what people would most typically identify with. It's what you'd see people going out and protesting and, you know, doing political stunts like on the streets and that sort of thing. But yeah, so they protest, they know, and to violation to positive values. They use a non-violent direct action approach or civil disobedience. There are a number of words that are thrown around for this. Probably an example of this I can think of is particularly in the last year during the Black Lives Matter movement that really took a peak, you know, June, July last year. There was some demonstrations here in Sydney where people were lying on the streets with their hands behind their back and we're refusing the kind of or pushing against the intervention of police. So that's, I guess, the kind of rebellious idea of community activism. But again, it puts the problems in the public spotlight. So it will go to any means to really create awareness of a particular social problem. And in that case, it's quite strategic. You know, Amnesty International is actually probably one of the larger human rights organizations that takes on this rebel approach. And they do a number of stunts, which some are effective and some aren't so helpful. But often the case with these stunts as well is that they're very exciting and courageous and risky. The backlash that they get from that is that it's just performative and it doesn't actually create any long-term changes. So adding on to that, yeah, so the potentially like harmful, ineffective ways of that rebellious strategy towards social action and change is that they often very much like self-identify as being on the fringe, or they make it person-centric, but in the wrong capacity. They, rather than elevating the voices of those with lived experience, they often try to restructure the narrative around people that aren't necessarily directly impacted by social issues. Another like criticism that people have in this rebellious take is that like they, again, by any means necessary, including violence and property destruction. And so that's again another criticism of the rebel is that these things tend to get a little bit out of hand and they're not so effective as well in that sense. And then again, like rebel act from strong negative emotions such as anger and desperation and powerlessness. I'm someone that definitely thinks that anger can be a positive emotion, especially when working in the human rights space. But when it is targeted towards an issue in a strategic manner rather than just as in a reactive manner. Also about rebels is that in that rebel space is that they're anti-organisation and opposed to any kind of rules and structure. And as I kind of spoke about before, the personal needs kind of outweigh the needs of the movement. And that's again, kind of tying into that issue of performance in activism. And then there's the change agent. So the change agent, again, uses people power, educates, convinces, and involves majority of citizens, is mass-based grassroots organizing, employs strategy, and promotes alternatives to problems. And some of the criticisms of this space as well is that sometimes they can be quite utopian, so promote visions of perfectionism or that are disconnected from current movements. They can sometimes be quite dogmatic, and they can also sometimes ignore personal needs of activists and often disengage from movements as well. So that's kind of a bit of a map of a roadmap of what community activism is. I'm going to pass on to the rest of the team just to kind of talk about their experiences within this space and some of their reflections on what is community activism as well. So does anyone want to kick off the conversation?
Happy to start the conversation. I think for a lot of students here who are interested in community and activism and organising like myself, when I started off as a fresh student, I really wanted to make a difference, and I found a lot of those things overwhelming and I didn't know where to start, and sometimes you feel a bit powerless in the grand scheme of things. I think it's just to keep in mind that even moving from an ineffective citizen to an effective citizen is a form of community activism. So making well-informed choices and just having those conversations with your friends or over the dinner table is a form of community activism. You don't have to go out there and join protests and, you know, petition and write letters to your MP and, you know, start a social media campaign. Just being in on the conversation and spreading awareness is a form of activism.
I'd add to that, I think,
No,
sorry, Kelly. I'd add to that don't be afraid or don't put yourself in just one box. You know, thanks to social media, you can change what kind of activism you show up with in the community, depending on, you know, the day, the month, the year, or the campaign. You know, as Athena said, having the conversations over a dinner table with your family, with your friends, is such a valuable tool of activism that people don't always acknowledge, whether it's posting on social media. You know, Facebook has some great tools of, on your birthday, you can highlight a campaign and raise awareness and donations for it. There's so many different types of activism that don't require you to be, you know, following every single news article or following every single legislative change. By all means, do that. That's a great way of staying informed. But I think often, particularly for young people, we feel a pressure to conform to, you know, one type, whether it's the reformer or the rebel, and, you know, don't fear the ability for each of us in this like global world of competing priorities to dabble in each form of community organizing and activism and find which one suits you.
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of like going on from that, is another great way to kind of start getting involved in activism is, like, I call it kind of like activism through service. So if there's some particular issue that you're passionate about, really kind of like drilling down to how that's impacting at a community local level, and what services are already in place that you can actually go and volunteer your time to, or if you've got a skill to go and share or something like that. Like for instance, like Share the Dignity is a really, really good one. If you're passionate about women's rights and you're passionate about gender equality, a big thing, you know, or a way that you can kind of like make a meaningful impact in that space is through helping to alleviate period poverty, and, you know, volunteering to like actually collect those products from your workplace or from wherever you can. And in doing so, you're still raising awareness about an issue that is a gender-based issue. So yeah, I think that kind of like activism through service is a good sort of starting point.
I think that the one thing that the model that Alice showed before has in common is that it's all those different types of activists are still just people who are seeking to bring about social and political change. And whatever way that manifests and however that works for you is of equal importance to somebody else that might be doing differently. And I think that among young people, there's a little bit of a misconception that if you don't know everything there is to know about a certain social issue, that you shouldn't speak up at all. But I think that is like never the case. I think to say something or to do something in your way or however you can is 1,000 times better than nothing at all.
There's also like, there's a helpful little tool, maybe if anyone wants to just have a Google, it kind of like summarizes kind of what we're saying. It's called the Circles of Commitment, and it's used a lot in community organizing and in grassroots activism. And it's when like a community organization tries to kind of get people involved, they talk about the circles of commitment. Then like the outside circle is just like being part of the community, and you can move then further in towards the crowd, the contributor, the committed, and the core. And sort of the point of it is to say, like, you can jump into any activist movement and you can jump into any stage of that circle. And if you're particularly interested in something, maybe you'll go closer to the inside of the circle and you'll do more. But people float through that circle at all times, and you at any point might be acting more in that space, or you might be acting less, and you should never feel pressured that you have to be in the center immediately and doing everything. You can just do little small things on the outside and you're still contributing to that movement.
Absolutely, I agree with everything you guys just said. It's very important points to be made. I think just like in reflection, listening to what we were talking about just then, I think, you know, we've been able to identify what is activism, but I think an even more important question to ask on top of that is like, what determines activism? Like what determines a cause that is worthy of activism? And how does that play a role in predicting the success of activism activities as well? I don't know if one of you wants to start the conversation, or otherwise I'm happy to.
We had a quite interesting. No, I've never. You're right.
No, go.
No, I was just going to say we had a really interesting debate/conversation about this before we actually started this presentation. We were talking about who determines what the agenda is at the moment, and Alice was talking about how there needs to be a greater need for community consultation and engaging the voices of those with lived experience. But I think the reality at the moment, and everyone else, please jump in if you will, if you want to add to it, is that currently it's moving towards that direction, but who determines what the agenda is kind of influenced by other things like the media, politics, you know, what else is there that influences at the moment?
Political spending and, you know, whatever the next election is. I completely agree that, you know, for community activism to be effective, it has to be bottom up, particularly when we're talking about vulnerable communities and their social justice. Lived experience always trumps political will, political spending, you know, whatever you want to bring to the table. It has to be led by vulnerable communities. And First Nations communities in Australia is the perfect example of how in this country, it doesn't play out like that often. Even just a big campaign like Closing the Gap, that is from a top-down approach. That's not to say communities haven't been consulted in the process, but, you know, I've seen this playing out time and time again. Communities bring their agenda, what's important to them, what's important from their lived experience, what's important based on what they're experiencing, the racism they're experiencing in different sectors every day. And the government, from a top-down approach, goes, that doesn't fit in with our political agenda, so we're going to ignore your lived experience. Community activism has to always include the voices of the vulnerable communities and be led by them, because they are always the masters of their own understanding and have to be the leaders of the change respective to their communities.
I think to build on Jacinta's point, which is absolutely spot on, what should determine the need for activism is tapping into community concerns that are widely and deeply felt, and sort of, you know, helping cultivate that community leadership. So, you know, marginalised groups need to be informed of the processes that affect their lives and have the opportunity to share their perspectives in a meaningful way in any kind of channel of activism that relates to their issue, because it's their issue. So, you know, the good approach is an approach that consults with and listens to the target population. And ultimately, that's what's going to be the most effective in responding to their needs, because they know what their needs are. No one can tell them what their needs are. So, you know, I think that it's super important, even on a personal level, that you're always reminding yourself to amplify those voices rather than speak over them. Or even if you don't think that you're speaking over them, but you're sort of positing what you think is best, if you don't have that lived experience, then you can't really say what you think is best for the people with that lived experience. So super important to remember.
Just want to add one more point to that, Taylor. I think you raised so many good points. I think that sometimes can lead people into not speaking up on issues when they don't have lived experience. And that is not what we're advocating for here. Social media is such a valuable tool that if you're passionate about First Nations justice, for example, and you don't have that lived experience, it's as simple as sharing someone who is an active community organizer in that space, sharing what they've said, sharing the words that they felt important to raise with community, the concerns that they're raising, the solutions that they're highlighting. You know, it's never a reason to sit back and do nothing if you're passionate about an issue. It's just a question of acknowledging that your voice isn't the most important voice in that room on that particular topic.
I would love to just add one more thing, and I appreciate that Alice probably wants to move on to the next question, but on the note of social media, Jacinta makes a perfect point, and the best way that you can do that, and I say this to everybody in my personal life, is that you should be working to really diversify your feeds, and sort of like reevaluate, you know, who you follow on Instagram, or on your other channels, and just think like, well, how many First Nations women do I follow? Like, how, you know, are there trans voices on my feed? You know, are there queer people on my feed that are sort of speaking about these things and speaking about the issues? Because if you're constantly sort of only engaging with people that look and sound like you, well, then you're going to have a difficult time sort of exercising that empathy for those vulnerable people and the marginalised communities, because you've never interacted with them. And so, yeah, I think that is very important as well. And now, absolutely, we can move on.
No, brilliant conversations, and they need to be had. And thank you for like taking the lead on answering those questions. I think, you know, drawing from what was just spoken about in that last conversation, the theme that kept coming up is leadership and activism, which is such an important pillar of effective activism. But as spoken about by the rest of the panelists just then, it's the conflict is like, you know, where is that agenda coming from? Where is that cause of activism coming from? And ultimately, like, where is that leadership coming from? So I guess like another question leading on from like that conversation is, I guess, what makes an effective leader in activism? Like what makes an effective leader in that activist space? And, you know, as drawing from what Athena had just spoken about previously, in, you know, preparations for this panel, we had a discussion as a team before like all conjoining here tonight. And again, some really interesting points were brought up, particularly in terms of the role of working with community leaders and having that professional humility as a team, you know, as our team as Voices of Influence Australia, having that humility to recognize the scope of our knowledge and then using us, the organization that we've created, as a vehicle to elevate the voices of community leaders that are experiencing these atrocities and human rights violations. But I'm curious, yeah, again, I will pass over to the rest of my fabulous team members of Voices of Influence to talk about, yeah, what we think makes an effective leader in this activist space, and what are some strategies that would kind of assist the leadership of community campaigns.
I was gonna jump on and say that the way that I kind of like interpret like a leader is that sometimes leaders are almost like visionaries, like in the sense that regardless of what level you're at, whether you're kind of like working at like a national issue level or like a community focused grassroots level, I think leaders have the ability to see the value in every person and kind of know how to, and not always necessarily mobilize people, but even to just sort of, recognize that other people's lived experience within their own community is valid, and to actually elevate those voices. I think, yeah, if you have to like kind of like go into like the values of a good leader or like what a good leader looks like, I think you do need somebody who can envision a different future or a different paradigm and sort of sees the possibilities in individual people to kind of like contribute their voices to that movement. Because I know like, yeah, like in the homelessness space and things like that, oftentimes like you'd have the main advocate who had access to both the media and the people who he was helping to house, or the people that he was working with to get into community housing. And as a leader, that particular advocate could see the value in all of these people with these years and years of lived experience going through this system. They know like way more about the system than any of the politicians who are making the system. And I think you need someone who can see that potential and can create the platform. In this case, this was like traditional media. So this was like news outlets and things like that, and protests and really like classic like grassroots, setting up tents outside Parliament House, that sort of stuff. But I think, yeah, you need a leader who can see the potential in people and can elevate those voices and then channel that into like meaningful activism. I hope I described that right.
I think as well, like as Kelly just said, like a leader is often like the visionary, but that doesn't necessarily mean they need to be this big figurehead and they need to be the only person you associate with a campaign. Like often the best leaders are the people who elevate the voices of the people around them. Like as we've just been saying, it's really important to elevate the voice of a community and community leaders. And it doesn't need to be about that one person, even if they're guiding the ship, like it's not just about them. And that's where the best leaders will recognize that, and they'll step back when it's needed and they'll step up when it's needed.
I guess that's where that humility comes in. And, you know, the focus, particularly in community organizing, needs to be about collaborative leadership. But when it, regardless of if it's collaborative or if it is a bit more of a figurehead, I think a really undervalued quality is a commitment to learning, and inherent in that is unlearning and embracing and, you know, having courage in the face of failure. We have particularly in this country, but in a global context as well, we have not seen great leadership. And I think a big part of that is people are not willing to acknowledge failure. They want to pass over it and pretend that everything's, you know, hunky-dory. And it's in failure that we have the most to learn. That doesn't mean glorifying failure, but it means looking at failure, you know, past decisions that didn't work, paternalistic policies that need to be changed, and not just stepping over it in you know, the spirit of moving forward, but actually sitting in the discomfort of having done wrong and airing that out, allowing communities to come to that table when they have been the ones that have experienced that wrongdoing, and having bravery to have those conversations and lead those conversations, I think it makes a great leader.
Yeah, I think to go to add on to that and just into what you said earlier about a bottom-up approach, I think an effective leader will, whether they do have a figurehead, will take a bottom-up approach and work in the grassroots to empower the people around them. I'm a massive fan of Brené Brown, and she has a special on Netflix that talks all about leadership and how it's really important to be in a space of vulnerability if you really want to make change. So I don't know if you guys have seen that or not, but I highly recommend, because I think then when you're also working with other leaders from other communities that are quite diverse, then you need to be in that space to hold that vulnerability to say, you know, I don't know much about your community, but I'm willing to learn. And I think that that vulnerability is a really hard thing for a lot of people, to allow yourself to be vulnerable in that space, especially with the title as a leader. So I think that that's a really important aspect to hold.
Awesome, no, fantastic conversations coming from that. I think it's a really critical conversation to have about leadership in this community activism space, particularly in the human rights conversation as well. I will be the first perhaps to boldly criticize Australia for the efforts that we're moving towards human rights. You know, I think it's also boldly hypocritical that Australia thinks we're in a position to comment internationally on the human rights violations that are happening, but yet refuse to kind of take accountability for the human rights issues that are happening here in Australia. And I think, you know, just to summarize it so well, is that we've had really poor leadership in the human rights space here in Australia. And, you know, drawing from what the rest of the guys have just spoken about, you know, having that humility and accountability to say, look, we messed up here. We really need to like fix these things. It's something that our political leaders don't necessarily prioritize. And I feel like until that happens, we're going to be stuck in this cycle, which is doing more harm to communities that are already facing plentiful human rights violations. Having said that, I have a lot of hope for the future of human rights and community activism. I think particularly involving young people. I think young people, I will always be the first to say that young people are some of the most politically engaged, involved, informed, educated. And, you know, albeit that's because we have access to that information. You know, we have phones in our back pockets the entire time. We are witness to everything within 2 seconds of it happening. But I think something that makes me incredibly proud of the younger generations is that there is this inherent responsibility to do something about it as well. And so there's almost this new revolution of activism leadership coming from Gen Z. And even looking historically, it is young people that have led these revolutions for human rights change and community change, whether you look over at India at the moment, where there is a massive revolution for social enterprises focusing on community organizing and tackling human rights abuses, or we look at the, you know, Black Lives Matter movement, which has been happening over the last 4 years, really, and that was started by young people as well. There are so many historical moments where we can point to young people and say, look, this is like young people in leadership. Look at what we can achieve. And I think that's why we also, one of the purposes of Voices of Influence Australia is to really elevate that impact of young people as well. And, you know, we have a fantastic team, which, you know, all speaking here tonight, which show that very clear direction and vision for that movement. But it takes an entire community to kind of rethink and restructure how we think about community issues and see people not just as receivers of rights, but also stakeholders in how we reinvent societies and communities to protect them. I think, you know, listening to like my colleagues as well, you know, we've spoken about what an effective leader is. And, you know, I mentioned previously before in a conversation we had preparing, talking about what that would be like and how to get to elevate community leaders. But I think a question that often people think about in this space as well is why leadership is actually necessary. Why can't people just, go rogue and do things by themselves? And we kind of spoke about previously that absolutely is a form of activism. It starts at the kitchen table, having those difficult conversations. But just to extend the conversation we just had about leadership in the activism space, perhaps one of you would like to touch on the fact, on why leadership is necessary in this space as well.
I think leadership is necessary because it's difficult to shape public consciousness without that direction and that lead. And that being said, obviously that leader is powered by community. By no means is that like a one-person show. But to shape public consciousness and build your constituencies, you need to stick to priorities relentlessly until you reach your goals of change, whether that's a gender equal world or an anti-racist society or climate justice. So I think that, as a short answer, to shape public consciousness effectively, you need leaders that are committed unwaveringly to those causes and will likely, it's sad to think that sometimes in your lifetime you might not see the fruits of your labor. And Clementine Ford actually touches on this in some of her sort of like presentations that she does with different organizations. I've heard her say a few times that it's about being that piece of the pie, and that doesn't mean that you might necessarily get to eat it, but one day someone's going to eat it, and that all of what you've done will be for that person in that moment. And I think when you're committed to serving others and human dignity is sort of at the forefront of your own agenda, then you are perfectly content with the pie one day going to someone.
I 100% agree with what you just said, Taylor. And it like so many important points. I think adding to that, what I see as why community activism leads leadership as well. For me, it always comes back down to community building and capacity building. Comes back down to education, but also just the fact that local communities need that social development and social support as well. They need, I think, my experience, and my observations in this community activism space is that the motivation is there, the cause is there, the passion is there, but a lot of the time communities, they want someone fighting in their corner. They want someone there to kind of I guess similar if we were at a dance recital and you want to see your parents in the audience, they want someone there that's going to be there to have their back and support that change that they're making. And that can be done through so many things. I think looking internally at Voices of Influence Australia, we're working on a couple of projects and programs at the moment which are really dedicated towards human rights education and community activism education, where we're setting up a youth leadership program, which will kind of put together a alumni group and put them through the program, and then have them become youth ambassadors for Voices of Influence Australia, and to be youth ambassadors for their communities as well. And I think like that kind of leadership and being able to support that self-actualization and capacity building of young people is so important, particularly in Australia, where young people are definitely that old-time paradigm of children should be seen and not heard translates so much into young people and the invisibility of young people within this space. But I'm curious, as to whether you guys, any of the others of my colleagues have anything to comment about, that community development and social support throughout community activism as a realm of leadership in this space.
Go, Marie.
Zoom is so tricky, isn't it? But I was going to say that I think it's also important to acknowledge that, in an ideal world, leadership is always really fantastic, but it's also there to be challenged. So leadership always provides, fantastic structures, but that doesn't mean that your leaders can't be questioned. I think it's really important as change agents to be working within that environment. Alice and I were talking on the phone the other day how in social work, you talk a lot about working in the system, against the system, and for the system. And I think that attributes back to leadership in how it's by challenging leadership and by challenging set systems and structures that we really create a lot of change as well. So leadership is fantastic and brings so much structure and good, but also be willing to challenge it as well.
Such valuable points. In kind of that same vein, I just want to raise that, we often think about leadership as a fresh new concept, but it's not. even in, you know, First Nations communities where it is, you know, a flat structure and a collective leadership, there would still often be an elected leader of that community to keep everyone kind of in that same value system, to keep people on track. And the key word there is elected, that people would challenge that leader. And if they weren't delivering on those promises, or if they weren't leading the community in an effective and collaborative way, they would be voted out and someone else would take that role. And I think now in this tricky system of social media where people become, you know, embedded as personalities who are leading, it becomes harder to kind of topple them off the, you know, off the top of the pyramid, particularly when they're not leading from a space of humility. I think it's important to remember that just because someone's a leader today doesn't mean they still need to be a leader if they're not serving our interests tomorrow. And an important part of that is remembering that we vote those leaders in, we decide who leads us. And even if we don't all agree, the democratic processes need to be supported always. And those leaders need to honor that in a from a perspective of humility, because they're not there to rule from their own ego, they're there to rule based on policies. You know, we're in a very tricky environment now after the Trump era, where politicians are, you know, seen as celebrities in some ways. That was never what this system was designed for. They were meant to be a central voice, not the voice.
I think,
absolutely. Taylor, go ahead.
just very briefly, I just think that tying together what Marie and Jacinta are saying, it's a really important time to mention that one of the biggest forms of community activism is you exercising your right to vote in a very diligent and well thought out way. And I just think it's very worthwhile to mention that, you know, all the energy that you have for the issues that you're passionate about, you should take it to the polls, because we are in, you know, we live in a democratic society, and federal election is nearing. It will be upon us soon. So, you know, that's your time to that's like, and that's something that we all have to do that, you know. So I think, I'm sure everybody on this call, you know, even subscribing to these kinds of events, that you take your right to vote very seriously. And I'm sure that you're sort of acknowledging the privilege that is in a democratic society, to have your voice heard through that channel. And I know that everyone here would likely, you know, make a well thought out choice. But I think it's a super important conversation to have with all of your family and friends around election time, because exactly as Jacinta said, we vote these people in. So.
Absolutely, no, perfect way to summarize it, Taylor, and thank you, like, all you guys for bringing those contributions to it. I'm curious, just like to shift the conversation slightly. Obviously, we've been speaking about community organizing and activism and the role of being an activist in this space, but I want to kind of more target the conversation about human rights in particular in this space. And so I guess like a question that I'm sure others have in their mind as well, is that, so how can we advance the promotion of human rights through community activism? You know, again, I know some people say that everything about activism is human rights, or everything about human rights is activism. But I think a lot of other people would say that activism is a vehicle of the promotion of human rights. But I would love to kind of open the floor to the rest of the team to talk about how we can advance the promotion of human rights through community activism and organizing.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about a very different or unique form of activism, particularly in the health space. Everything is very evidence-based. So it's all and well to go out there, protest and do all of that. But to make changes in STEM science and anything to do with medical, being heard is largely based on how much evidence you can bring to the table. So I think I'd really encourage people to participate in research, whether that be you go out there and you do your own research as a student as part of your research project, or you end up joining an organisation and you help them facilitate some of their own research, or you become a participant. A lot of you, I'm sure, have lived experience in something. You know, we're really diverse human beings. I'm sure people have been through a lot here. So I really encourage you to go out there and answer the calls for researchers looking for participants, because that's a really unique way to actually assist in community activism. So that's just me plugging the go out there and do some research. It's really exciting, I promise.
I think that's an excellent, I'm sorry, Kelly, please go.
No, that's all I had to say.
I was going to jump in as well on that. Kind of coming from like a media background in the space of engaging the media as like a vehicle for your activism, I think, and I definitely wasn't aware of this until I started actually doing journalism, but realizing that the traditional role of journalism and the news media is to actually hold governments to account. And I know the media gets a really, really bad rap, but when you actually utilize, whether it's community news or whether it's, you know, like your state newspaper or the Australian or whatever, actually bringing, like what Athena was saying, like bringing your voice or your experience to journalists or whatever it is that you're advocating for, and actually providing them with the story that they could use to actually like put that out into the media, because the politicians do actually listen to the news. They do actually read it, and it is scrutinizing their decision making, and they do take it seriously. And there's a lot of instances where maybe the media has played a irresponsible role in kind of, you know, generating sensationalized stories that the government has then acted on, and it hasn't been in the best interest of the community. But there's a lot of instances where with repeated media attention, there is a response by the government, and it is good. And that is because yeah, I mean, like even at like a community level, you'll have a community newspaper and you'll have a member for that community, and that member cares about what's going into their local community newspaper. So if there is a grassroots community issue happening, you can really use engaging the local media as a means to actually get access to the politicians and then advance human rights in that way. And I think that's another really effective form of activism. If maybe you're not super comfortable with, say, social media or something like that, or you don't have the resources to start like a whole social media campaign.
I think to touch on Athena's earlier point about the participating in research, I feel like in the early stages of my degree, I feel like many people relate to this. When you're researching for assignments and you are, you know, trying to import some statistics and you are using surveys, and have you ever wondered, like, who are these people that they're surveying? Like, do they just walk along and like pull someone? Like, no, people actively participate in surveys, and that's how those organizations or those think tanks or those research agencies get their data, because people care enough to participate. And I feel like that's not really well understood, and some people think that you know, it's a little bit like voting, like it's mandatory, the government just yanks you out and you're like, no, you need to participate in this survey. So it's, yeah, I think participating in research is really important. But to address the question like a bit more broadly, I guess it's easy to think of movements as sort of like spontaneous eruptions of activism that change hearts and minds with what seems like a short amount of time. But like those, you know, seemingly spontaneous eruptions are actually the product of extraordinary effort by those who work tirelessly for years or sometimes decades, sometimes to no end, to assemble like the core elements of movements, you know, building constituencies, garnering support for policy frameworks, lobbying, law reform, developing research. And so I think any way that you can participate in that, to, you know, to whatever's convenient for you or however you can, you should, because that little piece is what contributes to a movement. Like that, the movements go on for many, many years, and they're like building blocks, and they just get, you know, higher and stronger, and they have a sturdier foundation, and then soon they become, and sort of touching on what Kelly was saying, they become a bit difficult to ignore because it's everywhere. And it's everywhere because everyone's talking about it and everyone's lobbying for that change. And it's a commitment that everyone is making to lend their voices to the conversation indefinitely.
Add to that.
Sorry, Jacinta, go ahead.
To add to that point, I think that's why, Taylor, I agree with you, stories of people with lived experience is so vital, because often if we don't have that lived experience, it's easy for us to ignore the gross, abuse of human rights taking place. But when you actually hear a human being saying what this, legislation meant for them, it's very hard to ignore. So I think, utilizing lived experience, using storytelling, of course, in a safe way, is a vital component to how we hold people to account and how we bring community organizing into that human rights focus. But also, if it's possible in the movement, tying it to a demand for a legislative change, because it's all well and good to have a movement advocating for, greater awareness or change. But if we're not tying that to an identified way that we can change it in our legal system, it's very hard to hold those politicians to account and to get them debating it in that political space.
Absolutely. I agree with everything you guys have just brought up to the table. Something that I've been reflecting on, and just mindful that given that this is a panel targeted at university students, there's probably another demographic, which is international students who are either currently here in Australia or tuning in from overseas. But we've spoken a lot about that, partaking in those democratic processes and legal processes as a form of community organizing and activism. But perhaps those of us who aren't either permanent residences or citizens who don't have access to those same democratic processes, like participating in voting, like participating in these lobbying activities. I guess I'm curious as to open the floor again as to what kind of activities can these, who are still very, very important parts of Australian culture and very important mobilizers in the human rights space, but what can they be doing if not participating in those democratic processes, just on the basic grounds that their visa won't allow them to partake in those?
I think it's also, you can be an Australian citizen and be advocating for international issues as well. So something that probably a favorite word is definitely intersectionality. So acknowledging that human rights, even though there's kind of this universal standard for human rights, but human rights, the implementation of it and what it looks like in Australia is very different to how it looks like in a lot of other countries. And so that's when you kind of acknowledge those intersects and where, different issues start to overlap. So I think that also we can be, I think Australia has an abundance of things that we can be advocating for, don't get me wrong, but there's definitely a lot of issues that can be advocated for overseas. So I think in the arena of advocating, for example, if we look at feminist issues and gender-based issues, we can start to look at how poverty in different countries starts to overlap too. So I definitely get what you're saying, Alice, in the sense that sometimes Australia, when we relate it to politics, can be a very Australian issue. But I think it's really important to acknowledge as well that if you are an Australian citizen, there's such an abundance of issues that we can be advocating for from Australia overseas. And even though it might not be directly impacting you, working with those community members or with a representative that has experience for that change.
I'm happy to jump in really quickly. I think in terms of on the ground stuff, to sort of as a comparison, so anyone on this call, after this call, could sign up to Share the Dignity. And they would put you through a very succinct and good sort of volunteer initiation. You do a few little short courses, and then when I say courses, I mean little module things. And then, when they're doing their dignity drives, you literally go and pick up pads and tampons and you collect them, you count them, and then you give them to someone and they donate them to a charity. That is a ground level, very real way to contribute to the eradication of period poverty. And I think that, when you think about sort of that large scale view of period poverty and how that looks for homeless women or First Nations women and already women that are already fiercely marginalised in our community, in our society, that is directly putting something in their hands, directly helping. So that's a ground level thing that you could be doing. Another thing sort of on Marie's tune to advocating, I was speaking to Hayley Foster the other day. She is the CEO for Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia. She's an incredible woman. And I asked her, you know, what do you want to see from young people in terms of supporting women in gender-based violence? And she literally she's joining me with New South Wales Young Lawyers. We're doing an event in December, but she was saying how she was super excited about it because she feels like there's a bit of a gap with domestic violence campaigns and sort of young people, when it's really scary because soon they enter an age or a demographic where they're most likely to fall to that fate. And it's something that she wishes people were a little less scared to be involved with. Maybe they think because it doesn't apply to them, or, you know, you're living at home and maybe you're not cohabitating with a romantic partner, so perhaps domestic violence could never strike you. But obviously that's not the case. And she literally said that, you know, that organisation, Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia, they come out with campaigns they're currently doing run at the moment. And she said there's heaps of ways that young people can get involved. But the biggest thing is just spreading that news and sharing it and awareness raising. And she's always open to people contacting their admin teams about things that they can do to contribute, whether it be, you know, content creation or anything like that. And you'll find that so many organisations feel that way. But, you know, if you were to type in to Google human rights opportunities, that's not going to come up. So I think it's like, you know, you just reach out. If you're ever, you know, following an organisation and the incredible work that they do, and you think, you know, I'd love to participate in that, but I'm not seeing any opportunities or any volunteer forms, shoot their admin their contact email on their website and a message and just say, hey, like, I'd love to be involved. You know, it's really common that usually someone will respond and say, well, you know what, we do have this, or you could do this, or at the very least, share this on your socials. So.
Yeah. Absolutely, I agree with you, Taylor. And that's how I've gotten the majority of my experiences in the human rights space, is just reaching out and saying, I have time, I'm passionate, I'm available, like, let me put that use me and put that into that space. So fantastic advice in that regard. I think just in the interest of time, we might just move on now to the breakout rooms. So thank you for the fantastic discussions over the first half of this seminar. So for those of us watching, so we're now going to have a series of 2 breakout rooms, and we've decided to do 2 breakout rooms just in case those of us attending particularly wanted to speak to 1 or 2 of us and wanted us to facilitate the time for that. So we'll be doing 2 15-minute breakout rooms. And so myself and Meg will be doing a breakout room talking about stakeholder engagement and program and policy and project development in the community activism space, and also kind of mobilising community activism. Marie, who is our Peace and Conflict and Security Chair, will be facilitating a breakout room talking about community action in the international realm of things. So if you're interested in international social work or international community work, definitely jump into her room and she'd be happy to answer any of the questions you may have. Athena, who was our Health and Social Services Chair, she will also be facilitating a breakout room focusing on the role of community activism in promoting the right to health, and has, again, a wealth of knowledge speaking on this space. So I would recommend, if you are interested in health promotion, to jump into her room as well. We also have Kathleen Vega, who is our Children's Rights Chair, and she will be focusing on out-of-home care and children's rights and child protection, and again, the role of community in really promoting and protecting the rights of children. So if that, again, is an interest of yours and a passion of yours, I guarantee Kathleen would be able to share a lot of insight into that space. We also have Kelly, who is our Gender Equality Chair, who has spoken a lot about the kind of feminist discourse in the community activism space. So again, I have full faith that she would be able to answer any of your questions in that space. And again, I would encourage you to join her room if that was a particular interest of yours. We also have Jacinta, who is our Communities and Justice chair on our steering committee, who will be facilitating a breakout room talking about community development. And, you know, if you were as intrigued and enticingly curious of the stories that she has working with Indigenous communities, I encourage you to join her room as well, because she can enlighten you a lot more on the work that she's been doing. And finally, we have Taylor, who is our Legal and Political Affairs Director, who is going to be facilitating a room talking about direct practice in human rights, and kind of, you know, reconciling the legal sphere of things with social work and community development, which is such an important relationship and something that isn't spoken about enough. And so that is something that you're also curious about. I absolutely encourage you to join Taylor in her room. So we will now, you'll have the option to select any of those rooms. Frankie and Danielle have sorted that out for us, so I will trust their technical abilities to kind of facilitate that. But we will, we'll break out into a room for 15 minutes now, and we'll come back, and then you will have another option to jump into another room or that same room if you want to continue that conversation. And after that second breakout room, we'll come back and we'll have a conversation and discussion about the kind of things that were raised during those breakout rooms. Frankie, are we ready? Yeah, perfect.
Just for those who are on the mobile device, you might not be able to see the prompt, in which case, please send us a chat just to let us know which room you would like to join, and we can manually move you. Emily, I saw your message. Where would you like to go, please?
Oh, sorry, program development.
Sure.
Thank you.
Oh, good. Amanpreet, where would you like to go, please?
Fantastic. I hope you guys found that helpful and valuable during our time in this seminar today. I saw that a lot of you managed to kind of jump into a couple of them, which is great because we have a lot to talk about. And I have full faith that you're in the best of hands with all of us in the breakout rooms. I'd just like to spend like the next probably 5 minutes kind of just talking about the main points that were brought out from these breakout rooms in case people were eager to jump into others and didn't have the time to. So I might, Meg and I might start off by talking about the things that were coming out that came up in our breakout rooms. Meg, do you want to kick things off or do you want me to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Okay,
so Alice and I kind of spoke through our two main campaigns, one of which is looking at unaccompanied migrant children and legal guardian for unaccompanied migrant children, and also looking at a youth leadership program that we're looking to run out or start doing next year. And one of the questions we kind of discussed was like, how do you get involved with young people who are seeking to be activists, and how do you bring them into a space where they can learn activist skills? Because it's not often something that's like readily available. If you're just someone who, your main source of engagement with like different human rights issues is through social media, how do you then move forward in your activist journey, and how do you find avenues and resources to learn? And so we were speaking about how important it is for community organizing organizations to have a good network of people, because often most community organizing organizations, a bit of a weird way of saying it, they want to share information, and we're all kind of going for a common goal. We want as many people to be activists and to be active voices as possible. So using a network of people who have connections and getting people involved that way, but also then, as I was just saying, using social media and finding people who are teetering on that edge of activism on social media and then bringing them in that way is something that your typical old school organizations might not be doing, but it doesn't mean that it's not a good tactic. It's a good way of bringing young people into a space that they're not familiar with. Yeah,
definitely, perfectly summarized. I think just adding on to that, we kind of spoke about jokingly, which I think a lot of us attending the seminar today will relate to, specifically in the social work and community space. But as an organisation, we are working to work ourselves out of a job. We want to create, I think, with knowledge of power dynamics, Meg just made a good point of some organisations hold on to that power rather than relinquishing it back to the community through empowerment, through education, through those like that community development. And so for us as an organisation at Voices of Influence Australia, we're entirely moving towards that, where activism is achieved through individuals and through the community rather than governed by an organisation. And so through that is, relinquishing that power back to young people, but creating a network of people around you that also have those same values and ambition for community activism within the human rights space. I want to hand over, does anyone else want to jump in on the team that was just...
Yes, I had a fantastic conversation with a group of international students. I threw out the question to everyone of what is a prominent health issue in Australia at the moment. And we went on to the topic of mental health. And I want to give them a platform now. They spoke about mental health poor mental health in international students, and the lack of mental health services available for international students, and the fact that they're limited to working 20 hours per week, and some of these, especially the last 18 months, the pandemic that we've gone through, many students have had to choose between paying rent and eating food and their mental health, which is absolutely disgusting, because there are a limited amount of services out there for international students experiencing mental health issues. And I think that some of them knew how to navigate the system, but they brought up that often they'll walk into a service provider and the first question they get asked is, are you a citizen? And that determines whether or not they get help. So they were sharing all of that with me, and I think that's a huge issue at the moment. And I highly encourage them to go out there and do their own activism. And we made a quick joke about they should start their own international student mental health network. So yeah.
I think that's a fantastic idea, and I 100% would get behind that. It's such a necessary body to be established here in Australia. I think particularly, like, you know, talking the pandemic, the way that Australia approached international students and basically told everyone to go back home was horrific. And I think even before the pandemic, but now translating after the, you know, the pandemic as well, I think people are so much more aware of the need of mental health services for international students, but also those on permanent visas here. So for those of you that were in the room with Athena, and that is a serious project you're wanting to take on, you have the full support of Voices of Influence. I think it's absolutely necessary, and would support you in setting that up. Jacinta, do you want to jump in next and talk about what you discussed in your group?
Yeah, sure. It was, you know, two great panels, or I should say breakout rooms. The first one was a bit more intimate and both were really valuable. I'd say we didn't really talk too much about community organising. There was much more a appetite to talk about community engagement with First Nations people, which was so exciting to see so many people motivated to get involved, international students or also Australian citizens. The common theme, I would say, between both conversations was a real, you know, hesitancy to get involved, that kind of worry of not being able to involve themselves in the conversation appropriately, not having a lack of knowledge, you know, a lot of shame. And I just wanted to raise that as that's a common experience. And I love to say to anyone who wants to engage in this space, particularly for white Australians, that if you're uncomfortable, that's great. Because when you're uncomfortable, that means you're learning, that means you're being challenged. And most importantly, that means you're unlearning behaviors, you know, stigmas and truths that you've, you know, been taught your entire life. So the real wrap up of the conversation that we had in both breakout rooms was volunteering is a great way. It's something we've all talked about in this panel previously. Volunteering is a great way to have strong, long-term, sustainable and meaningful engagement because it allows you to build relationships, establish trust, which is so important in any vulnerable community, but particularly in the Australian context in working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The second really important factor that we talked about is doing your own learning and being a leader in your learning. That means acknowledging what you don't know, being vulnerable and being honest in what you don't know, and having an appetite to learn and not expecting, so important, not expecting First Nations people to teach you, but listening, learning through listening and doing your own research through reading amazing books by First Nations writers, activists, you know, leaders, and also, you know, amazing documentaries. Would like to plug one thing which I didn't remember to plug in the breakout room. If you haven't watched Incarceration Nation on SBS, or maybe it's iView, one of the two, please do. It's the most important documentary at the moment about First Nations justice and issues in that space for community.
Absolutely fantastic. I'd love to like explore more that you just spoke about, Jacinta, but in the interest of time, we'll have to keep it short. But I will agree to it, which is just as you said about to watch that program. Absolutely sensational and definitely eye-opening. Gave me a lot to think about, and it would give all of you a lot to think about as well. So something to keep in mind. Yeah, thank you for putting it in the chat, Jacinta. Taylor, do we want to jump to you to talk about what you discussed in your breakout rooms?
Yes, I'm very conscious of the time, so I will try and keep this very succinct. My breakout room is about activism as a bridge between legal matters and community engagement. And the premise is that you want to develop organising strategies that parallel legal representation in order to empower communities to define their objectives with their own voices and hold the state accountable to its human rights obligations. And basically, it's on the one hand, countries like ours often use human rights as sort of like a rhetorical tool to legitimise or depoliticise its policies, while on the other hand, marginalised communities employ human rights as a discourse of resistance at the grassroots level to reclaim their rights. And it's at this intersection of these two distinct iterations of human rights that the law and politics meet. And that's the pivotal point. So it's sort of to master that language of law and rights, and having a rights-based approach to everything. In terms of community organising, the last breakout room raised an interesting question as to, you know, how to deal with sort of converse opinions that are making it known that they hold a different stance to you, and sort of sometimes attacking you in your activism and challenging your validity or your connection to an issue. And I think that so long as that you are always amplifying marginalised voices from, you know, from a moral sense, you're not doing anything wrong if you are amplifying marginalised voices. And in that also flowed on to, you know, what's a practical way that I can sort of advance the interests of this community, you know, on a personal level. And something I suggested was creating like a one-page like resource document that has like the issue loud and clear, you know, what you would like to see from people in power with respect to that issue, and just as a form of awareness raising. And then you never know, it could, that itself builds momentum. So that's basically what my room was about. I'm sorry if that took too long.
No, not at all. I really like what you said about the discourse of resistance. And that's something that I think is more readily becoming a conversation that should be had. But it's something, especially in the community space, to be aware of as well. Well, I know we've got a few minutes left, so we'll keep rolling through. But Marie, do you want to talk about what we spoke about you guys spoke about in peace and conflict?
Yeah, I'll try to make it super quick. So in the first one, we kind of talked about some of the challenges that are involved when you're volunteering, and how someone brought up in the breakout room how it can be really time consuming and it can create challenges. I just recommend that if, you know, we do have busy lives, and if you can't in this moment, you know, be out there volunteering, doesn't always have to be a weekly commitment. It can be a once a month commitment, but also acknowledging that, you know, if that's not something that you can commit to, still keep up to date with the issues that are occurring. So, you know, human rights watch, keep up to date with the United Nations reports, still try to be involved in what is happening. Voices of Influence release a lot of up-to-date things as well, just to drop that in there. But we also then spoke about how sometimes we like to separate what's happening overseas and what's happening in Australia as like, okay, these are Australian issues and these are, you know, overseas issues. But it's really important to be mindful of the communities here that have a connection to countries and how our communities here can get impacted. But if you are a social worker and you are interested in doing overseas work and doing aid work, really important to check your privilege. I think sometimes we go over there with an agenda and it's like, I know best and I know everything about this issue. But in reality, you need to check your privilege. I don't know if I can make that any more of a prominent issue, that I think that before we do international social work and we go over, we need to go there without a planned dialogue, and we need to go there willing to learn before we create an agenda. So we kind of spoke about some of the issues coming from Australia and then going to do international social work. But yeah, check your privilege. That's a really important one.
I agree. It's such an important one. It goes in the same way of like coming from a place of professional humility as well, recognizing your knowledge, but also recognizing the knowledge of others. I also really like what you said, Marie, about how rest is a part of the process. Giving yourself that time to rest is part of the process. Activism work, campaigning it's emotionally taxing, it's exhausting. And I think most of us who find our way into this space are very committed and driven towards the cause of social justice, and just that matter itself is taxing in itself. But I think, you know, rest is part of the process. You don't have to be doing something every single day or spending every waking moment allowing these issues to completely encapsulate your mind or envelop your mind. Rest is entirely part of the process and something that all of us have to check in with as well. Kathleen, do we want to go to you next? I know you had a couple of busy rooms.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure thing. We had a lot to talk about. I'll keep it super short. I have put my email in there for those who wanted to chat more with me as well. But we basically spoke about child protection and how we advocate as caseworkers every day, even if it's something minor, and it just slowly builds up until it gets all the way up to the top of management. And that's how you advocate in a child protection, or one of the ways. We spoke a lot about what is DCJ's stance on the COVID vaccines as well, especially for children who are 12 and up, but they are in the care of the minister. Where to for them? And I raised an example of how all our children were told, no, you can't get it. You need to wait. The minister needs to approve this. It can't happen. And it got to the point where my organisation, we were just like, well, we're sick of it. So we contacted Dr. Kerry Chant. We had a chat with her and she was like, do it. They can't stop you. So do it. And what are they going to do? Take the vaccine out later? Like, it's too late. And so we had a bit of a chat about with Dr. Kerry Chant about, like, always do it first and then ask for forgiveness. Don't ask for permission from the minister, because it's never going to work. He's always going to say no. So just go and get the vaccine. And then, so that was another way that we advocated for our kids. And then once the kids started getting it from my NGO, the department and the minister just said, whatever, everyone can just get it. All the kids can get it. It doesn't matter now. So it was a way of just bringing it to their attention that just because you are in control of these children doesn't mean you're taking away their voices as well. We need to make sure that their voices are heard and they want it. So yeah, that's in a nutshell. We spoke about that, and also the removal of children and how at what point is their voice heard, and at what age does the court actually listen to them rather than just going on the basis of what they think they know best.
Absolutely, such important conversations to be having. I like what you were talking about, how as those of us as social workers or in the community sector, I will always say, as some of the frontline defenders of human rights, particularly working in children's rights space, or whether it's domestic violence and case management, social workers and those of us working in the community space will always be those frontline defenders. I also like what you said about how it's easier to ask for forgiveness rather than ask for permission, and sometimes you do need to be a little bit cheeky in that activism space and to bend the rules a little bit. But it sounds like some fantastic conversations were coming out from your room, which I'm glad that, like, those really critical conversations were happening. Kelly, I believe, Kelly, you're the last one, or have you gone through everyone?
I think I am, yeah.
Fabulous. Okay, Kelly, take it away.
So we started out, well, I went in with the intention of talking about, like, translating global women's rights issues into a community focus, but we sort of just went off on a tangent and just started talking about a bunch of different things. So we started actually talking about a topic that I think is quite important and that I do like to sort of reiterate in this space of activism and raising awareness of different issues, is this concept of call-in culture. So as opposed to, like, the call-out culture that I think sometimes we can fall victim to employing, or maybe not necessarily us, but, like, you know, others around, of just when someone's not getting it exactly right, they sort of just get shut down, or they get told that it's not okay to think that way, or but there's no sort of, like, constructive conversation. And I said, you know, like, for a long time when I was a lot younger, like with my dad, like, it was call out culture all the way, and it made it really hard for him as a person to actually learn about just different gender-based issues and what I was going through as a young girl and things like that. So I think I just wanted to really reinforce that, like, sometimes when people are coming out and they're saying something that you disagree with, it's going to be based on some inherent beliefs that they've adopted because of assumptions that have never been challenged, or assumptions that they can't work through on their own. And sometimes when you actually approach those conversations with a genuine curiosity of, hey, like, I'm interested that you think that, I don't agree with you, but I'm interested in why you think that, can we have a conversation about that and sort of move on? I think that's a much healthier way of sort of bringing men into the conversation of women's rights, and a lot more of a constructive way. And then, yeah, we kind of just went on from there. We talked about just, like, the largest topics of the social construction of gender, which I was like, I think Virginia brought it up. She was like, why is there all this pressure on women to have kids? And I was like, oh my God, we're going to be here all day. But yeah, so, like, just really cool conversations coming out. Did you want to say something, Virginia?
I wanted to say sorry.
No, it's great. I can go on about it all day. So yeah.
Maybe we need another panel just for that.
Yeah, we do.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
yeah, so that was sort of that was it really. And then I think, yeah, just talking about how when you are faced with those challenges of like people maybe questioning how you are as a woman, like really holding like true and like making those decisions for yourself. And then when you're in that position of empowerment, it's like kind of like fixing other women's crown concept of like when you're in that position of empowerment, actually uplifting other women, which I think Alice has done with Voices of Influence. When you sort of look at our panel, we're all women. So yeah, definitely using the opportunities that you've been given to uplift other women as well.
No, absolutely. I really like what you just spoke about, Kelly, about constructive dialogue around these things. And I saw that Frankie just put in the chat an article about what if instead of calling people out, we call them in. And I think that's something that's really tricky to navigate in this space, particularly, you know, we spoke earlier about how activism often starts at the kitchen table, and often with those difficult conversations we're having over family holidays or dinners. I've definitely been in those situations, and I'm by no means an expert of navigating those conversations. I don't think any of us are, given the complexity of these topics, but that constructive conversation and dialogue is so important when really promoting and protecting the human rights movement. Again, with the interest of time, we'll keep it short for that. There's obviously so many fantastic conversations that were happening in those breakout rooms, and I wish that we had more time to kind of just deconstruct those and understand them a bit more. But thank you everyone who attended tonight and who came with the energy to become involved and to really contribute to those conversations. It's so important, and thank you for the team for facilitating such fantastic discussions as well. I know we've gone over time, and I'm sorry for that, but I also just want to take the time to open the floor to anyone who attended that had any final questions that they wanted to raise. By all means, after this, we will send out a resource with the contact details of all of us on the panel. And so you feel free to reach out to us at any point and any time. But if we have no further questions, we will wrap up. Thank you for all your attention and energy this evening. And we'll hand over to Frankie to see how you want to wrap things up.
That's so good. Thank you, Alice. And thank you everyone on the panel. This was an absolutely brilliant session. And as you can see in the chat box, people are showering you with compliments and thanks. So let's take a moment to enjoy that. I'm going to stop the recording now, but the floor is open for anyone who wants to ask a question.
Fantastic. Yeah, by all means, ask the questions. I know you probably have other commitments, but if you want to stay on a bit longer and continue the conversation, we warmly invite you and encourage you to.